Hi all, welcome to Jen's Creation Station. Today I'm going to show you my creations with Tim Holtz's Distress Inks from Ranger and his distress technique. I've never done this. This might be old hat to some of you, but I just really enjoyed the results of these two cards. And today we're going to be making this card, and I hope you enjoy it. There's a lot of steps, but it sure is easy. For this project today, you'll need 3 pieces of cardstock. The first piece, I used Cajun Craze. You could use any rust-colored piece of cardstock. This piece is 8.5 by 5.5, and it's folded in half for an A2 size card. And then for the green, I used Always Artichoke, and this piece is 4.5 by 3 3/4. And then for the, what I call a watercolor technique with distress inks, you'll need a piece of white that is 3 inches by 4 3/4. Now we'll be cutting a little bit of this off for our edges, our corner pieces. Now for this colored card, I used 3 colors of the distress inks. I used Rusty Hinge, Peeled Paint, and Fired Brick. The Fired Brick is for the inked image on the front and the sponging. And these 2 colors I used on the main watercolor technique. I also used this stamp set. It's called Of the Earth from Stampin' Up. You could use any long stem flower, that would work just fine. I just stamped 3 images. A few other things you're going to need before we start is one of these non-stick craft mats. It's by Ink Essentials, I believe. This is the smaller one. If you ever watched Tim Holtz videos, he uses the same thing, but he has a big one. So I'm going to have to get a bigger one because this really isn't large enough. But it's handy because it works with this technique. You can use it with hot glue. Nothing sticks to it. Everything wipes right off. So it's really worth the investment. You'll also need a spray bottle of water. This is just a leftover acrylic stamp cleaner bottle that I cleaned out. Just regular tap water. You're also going to need your embossing heat gun if you have one, and you're going to need either a craft iron or a regular iron with no steam that you won't be using on clothing because it will stain the iron. I apologize if you see this glare right here. This is my overhead light. I really can't do anything with that, but I want to just show you my first attempt at this technique. I love the colors, but I had definite lines, and it really got muddied. So I changed colors and I lightened up a little bit on my pressure, and it worked the second time. I also want to remind you that if you have a cutting mat on the surface of your table where you're going to try this technique, remove it. If you get this heated up with your heat gun, it will warp and you will never get it to return. I've seen a lot of videos on how to repair it, but it never really works. Okay, for this technique, I literally followed Tim Holtz's directions on his video. And the first thing I'm going to do is take my peeled paint and I'm going to rub it against my non-stick surface just a couple of times. And then I'm going to take my Rusty Hinge, and as he says in his video, don't intermix them, just don't go this way. Get quite a bit of ink on there. And then you want to spray it until your ink bubbles with water. That looks pretty good. Now just set your piece of white cardstock in there and squish it. And that's your first layer. I'm going to move this aside and dry this with my heat gun. And as Tim says, your paper will curl, your cardstock will curl, but as it dries, it'll straighten out. Okay, here's my first layer all dried, and as you can see, it's straightened a little bit. Now I'm just going to go back in here and reverse my colors. I'm going to try to put some green where the Rusty Hinge is, like that, and some Rusty Hinge where the green is. Don't worry about the big blobs, they'll straighten themselves out. Try to avoid the big bubbles when you do this, and you'll need to do this 3 times. Okay, we're ready to dry another time here. So this is what it looks like after the second application. I still have some spots I need to fill. So I'm going to do that right now. I'm just going to dab the cardstock back in here. And you can kind of squish it a little bit and smear your colors. And just kind of work your way around to what's left of your ink. Okay, I've got one spot right there I want to get some color in. So I'm going to go down here. There we go. Now I'm ready to dry it. Now as you can see, this is all rippled and it is still damp, so what I'm going to do, I cleaned off my mat, all the ink and water off my mat. Now I'm going to turn it over, and I have this little ribbon iron, and it's perfect for this. It gets hot enough to straighten the paper or the cardstock. And this mat is heat resistant. It's perfect for this. There we go. And there is my flat piece of decorated cardstock. Now, as you can see, it's not as intense as this one, but I still like the result. So we'll move on to doing our stamped images and our sponging. Okay, the first thing I want you to do is cut off 2 1/4-inch strips off one end of your piece of decorated cardstock, and we'll set those aside for right now. Now what I did on my first image on this is I actually sponged around the edge with the rusty hinge, and then I sponged just the very edge with the fired brick. So that's what I'm going to do with this one. I'm just going to use a sponge dauber like this. I'm just going to kind of work my way in. Now I bought one of these fancy ink applicators, and the first thing that happened the second time I used it is it fell apart, so that's why I'm using my sponge dauber. So there's my darkened edge, and now I'm going to take my fired brick, which is a red, and just go around the very edge. And see how that just makes that pop just a little bit better. Now as you can see, I have a couple light spots here, and I'm actually going to take my rusty hinge dauber and kind of rub in some color there just to darken it up a little bit there, so that just so they don't pop out so much. Okay, then I'm going to take my fired brick. I'm going to sponge the edge of these. These are going to be my corner pieces. We're going to cut them in half so we have 4 of them. As you can see, I'm back on my beautiful blue mat, and I always put paper down when I'm inking, and this is just leftover computer paper that didn't get used. It's the wrong side. So my next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to put my flowers on the front. Now I have unmounted my sets, so they're just on the rubber, and this cutting mat is a really nice surface to use for inking. So what I'm going to do is take my fired brick, and I'm going to ink just the flower. And you get a little bit of ink on the stem, and then I'm going to take my peeled paint, and I'm going to ink the nice thing, and Tim Holtz is right about this, these stay wet, so you have a little bit of time to work with them. And the first one I'm going to do is right in the middle, like so. I'm going to ink it again, and just lay a second one just close to it, doesn't have to be exact, and a third time. And these are very raised, so you can see exactly where you're inking. It's really nice. I'm really enjoying these new ink pads. And then just one like this. And there's my 3 flowers. Now what I did on this one is I just used my peeled paint and went over the bottom a little bit, so I'm going to do the same thing on this just to darken this up a little bit. I'm just going to use my sponge dauber and just kind of rub it You don't want to actually set it down until you have it in a circular motion, or you'll have sponge dauber marks. There we go. Just kind of finishes the edge. Now, because my cardstock did still have a curl to it, instead of using my ATG gun, which for some reason just won't hold a curled piece of cardstock in place for me, I used my Scotch Quick Dry adhesive. Just ran a thin bead all the way around the edge and through the middle, and that will hold that in place for you. Now your next step is to actually mount this on the front of the cardstock, but before I do that, I'm going to take my fired brick sponge dauber and daub around the edge of this. It'll just make it pop a little bit. So here's my fired brick, my sponge dauber. See how that just brings that edge of the card down a little bit? Okay, now we're ready to center this on the card. Now would be the time to stamp your sentiment here, but I'm just going to real quick put this on the front. I'm not getting very close to the edges today, am I? Okay, there we go. Okay. And it's just centered like that. Now the next step I'm going to do is I'm going to glue these four corners in place. And I'll do that and I'll come back and I'll show you how I trim those off. This is what it looks like with the four corners attached. And again, I used my Scotch Quick Dry adhesive. I wanted a real good adhesive at the edges so it stuck good. And then I just flipped it over. And these are my adhesive scissors. I didn't want to get adhesive all over my good scissors. And I'm just going to trim all the corners right up to the edge. Okay, now the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take my fired brick and just sponge the very edges of these corner pieces so that they look like the rest of the edge. And there's your finished card. Thanks for stopping by Jen's Creation Station. Have a great day.